Okay, so it's Dr. Greg here. Welcome to the next module. We're going to be talking about infectious microorganisms. So that's going to include bacteria, viruses, fungal infections, and certain parasites that we're going to talk about. So an assortment of different infections that can invade the body and how we approach them. Okay, so why do we get infections to begin with? And why are some people more prone to getting certain infections? So when we're talking about infections, whether it's a viral, bacterial, fungal, or parasitic, uh, every every infectious microorganism has a virulence. So how aggressive is this particular pathogen to the human body? Okay. Combined with that is it requires a portal of entry. So it just depends on how this particular microorganism is able to enter the body. And we'll go into that in more detail. Plus the immunocompetence of the patient, right? So how strong and robust is their immune system? Is it a healthy, functioning immune system, or has it been compromised by an assortment of factors, such as maybe old age or a very, very young neonate? So the extremes of age can make you immunosuppressed. There's many drugs that can immunosuppress you. So, for example, we use a lot of corticosteroids. Well, they suppress the immune system. Okay, a lot of chemotherapy agents suppress the immune system. So, and on top of that, there's a lot of diseases that suppress the immune system, that affect the bone marrow and suppress the immune cells from the bone marrow, such as white blood cells and other factors that we'll talk about. Okay, so it's part of it has to do with the microorganism, part of it has to do with its ability to get into the patient, and a big part has to do how immunocompetent is the patient. Okay, and a big part of immunocompetence also is immunizations over the years. Has this patient had all of their immunizations from childhood onwards? Okay, that makes us immunocompetent as well. So it's not just the immune system as a whole. Has the patient taken advantage of all the potential immunizations that have been available to them? Okay, so let's just define the term pathogen. So it's any disease-producing microorganism. And as we mentioned before, that's typically bacterial, viral, fungal, and parasitic. And any of these can have the potential to enter the human body and set up a disease process, an infectious disease process. So a local infection is typically very limited to one part of the body. So for example, a bladder infection. Well, that's very localized, right? It's an infection of the urine within the bladder itself. Okay? Or how about a strep throat? Well, a strep throat is an infection of your pharynx from streptococcus. Very localized. It's just in the throat. A systemic infection is where the infection has spread beyond those sites, typically from either lymph nodes or from the bloodstream, and has gone beyond the initial local infection. So it's disseminated meaning it's spread all over, or it's systemic, again, meaning it's gone throughout the whole system. Okay, so the slide above we were talking about the potential for infections. We can also be colonized with microorganisms, which is very normal, right? So if you were to have a swab taken of your skin, you would typically grow all kinds of bacteria that are on the surface of your skin. So they're just colonizing their skin, but they're not causing an infection of the skin, okay? When we look at the colon, which is another term for large intestine, there's many types of bacteria that live in a cooperative way with you in your colon. And the colon has hundreds and thousands of bacteria, species that is. It has millions and millions of bacteria, and they're responsible for helping in the breakdown of waste. Okay, so we need those bacteria in our colon. It's a normal process that occurs. Okay, so just remember that in different parts of our body, say in our mouth, colon, skin, we're colonized all the time with bacteria. Okay, another example is the vagina. It will have a normal vaginal flora, we call it. Okay, and any of these areas can be impacted by antibiotics that we use. So when we use an antibiotic to try and destroy a certain infection, we alter the normal flora of the gastrointestinal tract, the mouth, the vagina, all over the place, and we can actually get a lot of side effects and adverse effects because of how we're altering the normal bacterial flora. Okay? So just to remember, bacteria, some fungal species live naturally on our skin. We don't have a skin rash or anything. They just live there. Okay? As I mentioned before, this occurs in the mouth and the pharynx, and also the vagina. Now, when we're talking about antibiotics, when we take an antibiotic, we run the risk of destroying some of our healthy normal flora in the mouth, and then that can allow the overgrowth of yeast in our mouth, which will lead to thrush. So oral thrush can occur from any antibiotic use. You can get overgrowth of yeast in the vagina because the bacteria that the woman took destroyed her normal flora in the vagina, and it allowed yeast to become overgrown, leading to yeast vaginitis. Okay, so we always have to think of that when we're using antibiotics, that we are already colonized. It's not causing any harm at all, but we could alter that with antibiotics and create significant adverse effects. Okay, so when we're talking about infectious portals of entry, let's just start at the top here with infectious agent. So this is just a chain of infection. So an infectious agent is going to have a reservoir, right? Somewhere where the infectious agent exists and has potential to spread. Okay, so let's say that is a mosquito. So the infectious agent is malaria. Where's the reservoir? A mosquito. Okay, where's the portal of exit? Well, when it's going to exit through the mosquito, through an insect bite. That's the mode of transmission. Okay, the portal of entry into the human will be the bite, the puncture of the skin, into a susceptible host, being the human, where now malaria can take hold, and the parasite can now divide and cause disease within the patient. Okay, so typical entry points into the body is gastrointestinal tract, so oral, right? So in your mouth, for example, or oral. Respiratory, so you inhale it. Genitourinary, which would be typically STDs, for example, can be genitourinary, so you can get herpes this way, you can get gonorrhea, HIV. The placenta, many infections can traverse the placenta during pregnancy. So the pregnant woman becomes infected with a certain infection. It travels via the placenta to the fetus and now sets up an infection in the fetus. Okay, so these are common areas. Skin is another one. So whether it's a puncture from a mosquito bite or a wound that becomes infected, another common place to enter the body. Parenteral, typically that's going to be, again, from IV injections, IV blood transfusions, or intravenous drug abuse, right? It can be from IV punctures. So just think of all the ways that microorganisms can get into the body. Okay, and most of these will come into play. Okay, so establishing an infection, so portal of entrance. How does the microorganism enter the body? And different microorganisms enter in typically different ways, right? So how does HIV gain access to your body? It's typically through some blood-blood interaction, right? How does hepatitis A get into your body? So the virus that causes hepatitis A is typically through the digestive tract. Hepatitis B, another liver infection, that is typically through sexual activity or or through intravenous drug use. Okay, so every different microorganism will have a slightly different way of its main route of getting into the body. Okay, adherence. The organism needs to be able to attach within the body so that it can set up infection, right? And pathogens have all kinds of ways of doing that. One example is a protein called adhesin, where the microorganism can attach into the blood, into the body, and then set up infection. Colonization. So if you're colonized and then, for example, you take a medication such as an immunosuppressant, so a drug that suppresses your immune system, or an antibiotic, that can change the colony and now become an infection. Okay, and we spoke about that in terms of when you're taking antibiotics and a healthy colonization now becomes, say, a thrush infection in your mouth, or yeast vaginitis in your vagina. So colonization can go to infection if the right circumstances occur, such as suppressing the immune system or taking an antibiotic that alters the normal flora. Okay, so what about avoiding host defenses? So is the organism able to avoid the immune system somehow? And if it's able to do that, it can set up an infection much more easily. Okay, and on top of that, the infection creates a host injury. Okay, so how does the infection create injury in the host, being the patient? So for example, bacteria that have been inhaled and now set up an infection in your lung are called a pneumonia. Okay, so you have a bacterial pneumonia. How is that going to impact the patient? Well, they're going to have a fever, they're going to be short of breath, they're going to be coughing up phlegm, they're going to be weak. So, and if it becomes an overwhelming pneumonia, they may require mechanical ventilation, meaning they can't even breathe for themselves anymore because they're so short of breath. Okay? Or the bacteria could go into the bloodstream. And once it goes into the bloodstream, the patient can become septic. So bacteria that have poured into the bloodstream can create sepsis, which is a whole constellation of inflammatory changes in the body. And we'll talk about sepsis in another module. Okay, so when I give you examples, it's just for you to make connections. It's not for you to know everything about HIV or hepatitis. It's just to give you examples. Okay, and here's some common routes of transmission, right? So aerosolized and airborne. So airborne just means that it's managed to get into the air, say from coughing. Aerosolized means it's able to attach to the droplets, and they can travel much further. Okay, so is it airborne? Is it aerosolized? That's an important factor in how far the infectious process can be contagious. And notice all the ones that are listed there are viral. So influenza, virus. Common cold is typically a rhinovirus or a coronavirus. Chickenpox, mumps, measles, those are all different types of viruses. Okay. Is it transmitted through direct contact, meaning fluids or tissue? So sexually transmitted diseases, such as HIV, typically need contact of different fluids. Typically blood is the main route. Chickenpox also can be contracted through direct contact. Head lice, one child to another, by playing with each other, hugging each other, the lice goes from one child's hair to another. Okay. Hepatitis B or C, typically direct contact with blood. Okay, or sexual activity in hepatitis B especially. Okay, and that's why most of us have been immunized for hepatitis B early on in childhood to prevent us from getting hepatitis B as we grow older into adulthood and we become sexually active, or some of us perform high-risk activity. Okay. What about fomite contact? So fomite is just basically anything where the pathogen is just sitting on. So a piece of furniture, a ball, anything where the pathogen is able to survive. And viruses and bacteria can exist on fomites and transmit once someone else touches the fomite. Okay. Oral transmission, meaning you've touched something with your hand and now you've put your hand to your mouth, right? Rotavirus, which is a diarrheal illness in children. I mentioned hepatitis A as a common route of transmission is oral transmission. And then food poisoning, salmonella, campylobacter, those are forms of food poisoning that are orally transmitted in food that we've eaten. Vector transmission means that it's come from some kind of a vector, such as a tick in the case of Lyme disease, or malaria in the case of a mosquito. Okay, so it has a vector. Zoonotic always means that the infection has come from an animal. Okay, so an infectious disease that has been spread from an animal. So rabies is a perfect example. So rabies is a virus. How do you contract rabies? Typically from a rabid animal, right? From a bite. So whether it's a raccoon, a fox, a skunk, a bat, if they're rabid and they bite you, then you can develop rabies. And the same would go with anthrax, which is an infection in farm animals, and through contact with them, you can develop a zoonotic infection. So zoonotic always means transmitted by an animal. Okay, so factors influencing virulence of a pathogen. And remember, virulence means how aggressive is this pathogen to create a deadly disease, right? So here are some of the factors that make a microorganism virulent. So some microorganisms can secrete toxins. In particular, bacteria can release a lot of toxins into the bloodstream, leading to even further illness and disease. Okay, so we call them endotoxins or exotoxins. So endotoxins are proteins or fat molecules that live on the cell wall of bacteria, and when the bacteria is destroyed, they all break off and go into the bloodstream and can set up incredible amounts of inflammation. So they're in the cell wall of the bacteria. Exotoxins are toxins that bacteria secrete into the bloodstream to create even more illness in the patient. Okay, so the toxins that are secreted by pathogens can influence the virulence. The ability to attach to the host definitely is important. If the infection can't attach to a patient, then it's not very virulent. It's not gonna set up infection, right? So some of the most virulent infections are ones that have a very high ability to bind to humans. Okay, the ability to evade the host, right? To evade phagocytosis, meaning there's cells in your body which are part of the immune system that want to surround the bacteria or virus and destroy it, and those are phagocytes. Okay, so if the bacteria or virus is able to avoid them, or they have mechanisms within the bacteria or virus that protects them from being destroyed, well, they're going to be much more virulent. And an example for it is H. pylori. So it's actually Heliobacter pylori, is the name of this little tiny bacteria that can live in our stomach, and it gradually destroys the mucus layer in the stomach and then bores a hole into the stomach lining, leading to stomach ulcers that we also cause peptic ulcers. Okay, so in actual fact, ulcers are caused in part by this little hardy bacteria. And it's a tough bacteria because it can live in the stomach, which has a pH of 2 or 3. So it has to be a pretty tough bacteria to be able to live in that really low pH environment. Okay. The ability to alter host defenses, well, that is a huge one with HIV, right? So human immunodeficiency virus enters typically through blood-to-blood contact. So with an infected patient that passes on the HIV disease or virus to an uninfected patient, typically through fluid transmission, right? And it's not usually orally transmitted with kissing. It's usually a blood transfusion, although that's very rare now with blood screening. Sexual activity can pass on HIV from one person to another. Or illicit drug use, right? So sharing of needles with one person who has HIV, passing it on to someone else. And of course in healthcare, with deep needle stick injuries or while performing surgical procedures on an HIV positive patient. Okay? So HIV enters some cells that are called CD4 cells. The other term for them are T helper cells. They're part of the immune system, and HIV gradually destroys part of the immune system of the human. So it alters the host defenses significantly. Okay, and we'll talk about HIV much more later. Invasive factors. So again, some pathogens can release enzymes that can break down the barriers that are stopping them from getting into the body, right? So bacteria and viruses have come up with all kinds of ways of getting into the human body, okay? Okay, I won't spend too much time on this slide. This is just giving you an example of an endotoxin on a cell wall of a microorganism, and the endotoxin is going to be recognized by the immune system of the body, and there's going to be an immune reaction, right? So when there's an immune reaction to an invader, there's often fevers, chills, all kinds of symptoms because the body is sensing a foreign invader, okay? An exotoxin is something that's actively secreted by the microorganism to enter the body, okay? And they're typically more deadly because they've left the bacteria, for example, and gone into the bloodstream. So an example here is there's a bacteria called Vibrio cholera, and cholera produces a toxin that it releases, an exotoxin, and the exotoxin causes massive amounts of diarrhea because it harms the intestinal cells of the colon. So when you hear about cholera outbreaks around the world, they're usually dying. It often happens in children in very crowded places, but they're usually dying of dehydration because they have such massive diarrhea that they become significantly dehydrated. They're not able to keep up with all the fluids that they're losing, and they die of dehydration. Okay, so what are some common pathogens that we're going to talk about? So definitely the first one, bacterial infections. Would I say these are the most common? No, definitely not. They're probably one of the most treatable that we encounter. So, and that's because we have an assortment of antibiotics. Now, the antibiotics that we have Many bacteria are starting to become resistant to the antibiotics, meaning that even though we administer antibiotics to a patient with a certain bacteria, the bacteria is still able to thrive. Okay, so bacterial resistance is increasing with time. Let's go on to the most common infection, and that's a viral infection, right? By far the most common. And we do have some antiviral medications. They're not as effective as antibiotics. We can't use them in every viral infection because many viruses don't respond to them. And often the end game is not to get rid of the virus necessarily. It's more to control the virus from spreading. So for example, HIV medications. It doesn't get rid of HIV, but it suppresses the virus to the point where it doesn't lead to AIDS. Okay. Another viral infection would be, say, a cold sore. So herpes simplex 1 on your mouth, or herpes simplex 2 on the genitals. We can treat it with an antiviral, but it suppresses it. It just shortens the duration of how long you'll have the cold sore or the genital herpes, but it's still going to return another day because the herpes virus is still remaining within you. You haven't cleared the viral infection. Okay? A lot of viral infections, such as the common cold, just clear on their own. They don't need any antiviral medications. And in fact, we don't have many antiviral medications for the common cold. Your immune system takes care of the common cold viral infections. Okay, fungal and protozoal infections, they're much less common in North America. They're more common in developing countries, but we can talk about some of them. And there are an assortment of treatments for them. Okay, so here's just some examples of infections with microorganisms. So when we're talking about a bacteria, I think I mentioned these two actually. Strep A leading to strep pharyngitis or strep throat, and E. coli, which is a very common bacteria that lives in your colon, and it lives there in a natural way. It's not potentially as an infectious way, but it can lead to bladder infections. Okay, so bacteria are single-celled organisms. Some of them can produce toxins, which makes them more virulent, and we identify them by the shape and the staining, and we'll come to that. So bacteria have different shapes under a microscope, and they take up different stains differently, which allows us to identify them and which species they are. And then once we know the species of bacteria, we often know the virulence of the bacteria. Okay. Viral infections, we spoke about coronaviruses and rhinoviruses leading to the common cold, herpes virus leading to genital sores, cold sores. Viruses need host cells to reproduce. Okay, so a virus is not a complete living particle. It needs to get into your cell and use your machinery to divide. Okay, so it's way smarter than a bacteria. The virus gets into your bloodstream, it gets into your cells, it sets up shop, and then it inserts its RNA or DNA into your genome and starts making its own material. That is unbelievable, right? So viruses can be DNA or RNA viruses, and they take over your cells, use your energy to make their own little viral particles to replicate further. Okay, so pretty amazing little infections. When we're talking about fungal infections, a superficial infection of the skin we would call a tinea infection. So tinea is just another term for a superficial fungal infection. If you've ever heard of the term ringworm, well, ringworm is the kind of the layman's term for a fungal infection on the skin. And where do we get fungal infections on our skin from? Well, they love moist, warm areas of the body. So between our toes, in our groin, under breasts, in our armpit, are lovely places for tinea to grow, okay, and set up a superficial skin infection. Deep fungal infections are usually inhaled, so inhaled from either the air or ingested through water. And when you have a deep fungal infection, it usually means there's something wrong with your immune system, okay? The body really shouldn't develop deep fungal infections, or at least tolerate and be unable to fight a fungal infection that's planning to invade it. Okay, so an example of patients that develop fungal infections would be patients that are on chemotherapy drugs, HIV patients, as their immune system gets weaker and weaker, can develop deep fungal infections in their lungs, in their brain, in many parts of the body. Okay, protozoa are basic. Protozoa and worms are parasites. Okay, so malaria, for example, from a mosquito bite leading to an infection. Head lice or body lice, which we'll talk to in the last module, is pediculosis. Pediculosis is just the medical term for lice. Giardia lamblia is a parasite that we get from dirty water, contaminated food, typically in third world countries, but we can definitely get it from dirty water or contaminated food in North America as well. Okay, so these are examples of parasitic infections, and each of them has a different type of life cycle. Okay, so malaria, for example, typically gets into the bloodstream. It infects red blood cells, and it causes red blood cells to break open. Another term for that is to hemolyze. So hemolysis is the breaking open of red blood cells, which the malaria infection can do. And finally, worms. We can get intestinal worms, such as pinworms or roundworms in humans. And hopefully we can spend a bit of time talking about those as well. They're pretty common in children, since what do children do? They eat soil, they eat bits of their sandbox, and that's where worms, in particular pinworms or roundworms, live. Okay, just some definitions that we've mentioned already. So a vector is an organism which can carry and transmit the infectious agent, right? And here's just some examples. Malaria, a mosquito, ticks can transmit Lyme disease. A reservoir is where the organism can thrive and live, right? So, for example, in the soil, there is endless amounts of Clostridium tetani. Okay, that's the bacteria that can lead to tetanus in the human body. Or in humans, we are a reservoir for COVID-19, right? That's how it's being spread from one person to the next. So we are a reservoir, and once we come in contact with another human, if we're COVID positive, we can pass it on to the next human being. Okay, so here's a nice slide showing you the chain of infection. Whether it's a virus or a bacteria, there's going to be a reservoir somewhere. Whether it's in a mouse or a tick or a human, there's going to be a reservoir where the microorganism can thrive. And then there's going to be a mode of transmission. Is it droplet from being coughed on? Is it airborne? Is it contact? Is it a vector type of transmission? Is there a fomite involved? Or is there just a vehicle, such as food poisoning, right? A mode of transmission, and then, of course, a susceptible host that needs a portal of infection. So the portal of infection being by ingesting something, by inhaling it through the skin, either by direct skin contact or by an injection. There's all kinds of portals of infection. Okay, so what's epidemiology and the difference between incidence and prevalence? So epidemiology is just the study of the incidence. So how frequent is certain infectious disease, right? So an example of epidemiology is knowing the incubation period of a certain infection. How long after being in contact with someone with a common cold will you develop symptoms? That's the incubation period. So during the incubation period, you have no symptoms, okay? And every infection will have a different incubation period. Not that you need to know them all, just to know the term, okay? How is the disease spread? That's part of epidemiology. What's the natural history of the disease once a patient acquires it? Do they typically clear it on their own? Do most people die of it because there's no treatment, such as Ebola? Is it very treatable with antibiotics or antivirals? How virulent is it? What's the kill rate, the death rate? So all that is epidemiology, okay? The incidence is basically what's the rate of occurrence of this disease over a period of time. So how many people per 1,000, for example, are developing this disease over the span of a year? Could be an incidence rate. So if someone says to you, there's a 5 per 1,000 incidence rate annually, it means for every 1,000 people in the population, 5 people are acquiring it over the span of a year. The prevalence is telling you the percentage of the whole population that has the disease right now, okay? So if they were to take the whole population of an area and they'd say the prevalence right now is that 15% of our entire population has this disease. That's the prevalence. So incidence is what's the rate of acquiring the disease. Prevalence is how many people currently have the disease. Okay, so the term immunocompetent. So immunocompetent means that you have a healthy immune system. You have the ability to mount a normal immune response and to fight an antigen, which is just a foreign molecule that the body recognizes as foreign, or an infection. Okay, so if you say that I am immunocompetent, it means that I have a fully functioning immune system. And typically, to be immunocompetent, you're going to need a fully functioning immune system, which includes your white blood cells, right? And we'll get into this much more in another module, but you need to have a bone marrow that can produce healthy white blood cells that lead to different types of white blood cells. I don't want to get into too much detail right now. And those white blood cells are able to fight off infection. Okay? In this image, you see lymphocytes, which are a type of white blood cell. There's actually 5 types of white blood cells. We're not going to do them now. That's for another module. Lymphocytes, B and T lymphocytes, are very involved in having an immunocompetent system. Now, immunocompromised will be the opposite. I have some kind of a disease, or I'm taking some kind of a medication that is suppressing my immune system and causing me to be immunocompromised. Okay, so here we are at immunocompromised. So a disease such as a bone marrow cancer, bone marrow failure, or drugs such as corticosteroids or chemotherapy and many other drugs that lead to bone marrow failure or lack of production of cells in the bone marrow. And remember, all of your blood cells and your immunity cells are made in the bone marrow. Okay, so when we look at this slide, we're not going to spend too much time on it because there's a whole module on this. But when we look at this slide, you'll see at the top that there's a stem cell. Well, a stem cell can turn into anything, which is amazing, right? A blood stem cell living in the bone marrow can turn into any kind of blood cell. So if we go to the left first, you'll see that that stem cell can become a red blood cell. It can become a platelet for clotting, right? It can become 5 different types of white blood cells, okay? So, and when I say 5, I'm referring to basophils, eosinophils, neutrophils, lymphocytes, and what are called natural killer cells. No need to know those now. We'll do them later, okay? But those white blood cells are going to be partly responsible for causing inflammation in the body and being a big part of your immune system. Okay, so think of the bone marrow as making 3 lines of blood cells: red blood cells, platelets, and white blood cells. What do red blood cells do? They carry oxygen to deliver to the cells of the body. What do platelets do? They are one of the first little cells to help plug up a bleeding area. Okay, they form what's called a platelet plug. What do white blood cells do? They're involved in inflammation and the immune system. Okay, so we're just spending some time talking about infections and definitions. Nothing too specific yet. And let's move on to another term called a hospital-acquired infection, or what we used to call a nosocomial infection. And this is an infection that we picked up while we were in hospital. So you didn't go to the hospital with this infection. You didn't have it prior to showing up at the hospital. You acquired it during your hospital stay. Okay? So something while you were in hospital caused you to develop an infection. Okay? And there are many ways of getting an infection in a hospital. So some of the common ones, how about putting a Foley catheter in someone? Well, that's a perfect way for them to get a urinary tract infection, such as a bladder infection. Respiratory infections. There's many people coughing in hospitals with the ability to for you to inhale the airborne pathogens and develop a pneumonia. You're in bed a lot. That makes the lungs more prone to infection because you're lying down. You're not moving very much. So you have people coming into your room that could carry the infection to you, right? From dirty hands. Surgical wound infections because you've had a surgery. Skin infections from being in contact with either fomites, which had bacteria on them, or from someone who had contaminated hands. Okay, so in actual fact, healthcare professionals have to be very careful. We can spread disease from one room to the next very easily without properly cleaning ourselves, in particular our hands, and being aware not to go to work sick, right? So that you spread an infectious microorganism to patients in the hospital. Okay, so what's an opportunistic infection? Well, this is an infection where a pathogen, such as a bacteria or a virus or a fungus, has taken advantage of the fact that a patient is immunosuppressed. Okay, so a perfect example is someone with HIV. And with HIV, their immune system can potentially be devastated, and they start to acquire opportunistic infections. So you can have adults with HIV that are immunocompromised and developing all kinds of strange pneumonias, all kinds of strange fungal infections in their lungs, in their brain, because they're so immunosuppressed. And typically, these pathogens would never invade a healthy patient with a normal immune system. So we call them opportunistic infections. Patients that have had chemotherapy and their bone marrow is severely injured and suppressed by the chemotherapy. Well, they're open to all kinds of opportunistic infections as well. Okay? So these infections very rarely would get into a healthy patient. Okay? And we wouldn't expect to see an opportunistic infection in a healthy patient. We would actually question if someone was getting these odd, uncommon bacterial infections, we would actually start to question whether they had a normally functioning immune system. Okay?